Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rick Hasen of UCLA Law and the Safeguarding Democracy Project. Thanks for joining us for the fourth of our fifth events this year, looking at election-related disinformation in 2024 and in the future. Before I introduce today's panelists and program, let me just tell you about the next event of the Safeguarding Democracy Project. On Thursday, April 10th at 12:15 p.m., Pacific time, we'll be having a webinar entitled Partisan Primaries, Polarization, and the Risks of Extremism. The panelists will be Julia Azari of Marquette University, Ned Foley of The Ohio State University, Seth Maskett of Denver University, and Rick Pildes of NYU Law School. I'll be moderating. The event, as all our events are, is free, but registration is required. You can register for this event as well as see videos of our past events and other materials at our website, Safeguarding Democracy Project, safeguardingdemocracyproject.org. Well, today I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to our webinar entitled Combating False Election Information, Lessons from 2024, and a Look to the Future. We're joined by three excellent panelists. I'm just going to read their brief introductions, but we'll be sharing in the chat a link to their full bios. Alice Marwick is Director of Research at the Data and Society Research Institute, a Research Associate Professor of Communication and Senior Faculty Researcher at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life, which she co-founded at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She studies the social and cultural implications of social media technologies and is best known for her work on media manipulation and disinformation online. Her most recent book, The Private is Political: Networked Privacy and Social Media, was published by Yale University Press in May of 2023. Sorry, I'm a bit of a mess here today. Dr. Kate Starbird is a professor in the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. She's also adjunct faculty in the Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering and the Information School, and a data science fellow at the eScience Institute. She's co-founder of Washington University's Center for an Informed Public, which was formed in 2019 around a shared mission of resisting strategic misinformation, promoting an informed society, and strengthening democratic governance. And Joshua Tucker is professor of politics, an affiliate professor of Russian and Slavic studies, and an affiliate professor of data science at New York University. He is the director of NYU's Jordan Center for Advanced Study of Russia. He's one of the co-founders and co-directors for the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics. Welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us. And I would invite you to turn on your cameras and audio. And let me say to those of you who are watching this live that if you have questions for our audience, please use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your Zoom box, and I will try to get to some of those questions at the end of the evening, at the end of the afternoon, excuse me. All right, let me open up by welcoming you and asking, I think, we'll on this first question, we'll go to Alice, to Kate, and then to Joshua. I just open with a broad question. How did the election information environment look in 2024 compared to 2020, especially online, and what accounts for any changes we might have seen? So let me start with you, Alice.
Thanks, Rick. It's a pleasure to be here, especially with Kate and Josh. We've all been working on disinfo alongside one another for a while now, and it's great to be with them today. So I'm going to highlight three main changes, I think, between 2020 and 2024. The first is persistent false narratives. So there's a lot of misinformation narratives from 2020 that we still see persisting into 2024. There are false claims regarding things like non-citizens voting and election fraud that continue to circulate, but then they adapt to the new political context. And I think what we know now about misinformation is that it circulates as stories, and the stickiest ones persist over time. For example, the idea that the 2020 election was stolen became common knowledge within certain political circles to the point where election denial became a marker of Republican legitimacy. And other stories like immigrants in Springfield eating cats and dogs, they draw on long-standing bias. They're new formations of very old stories. The thing is that these stories feel true. They coincide with people's common sense perceptions of things like the dangerousness of immigrants. And they're more compelling than just a dry accounting of facts. But if these stories are accepted as true, it creates this foundation on which to build a shared but false reality that maps to partisan leanings. And I think we really have seen this accelerate in the last 4 to 8 years. The second thing is the mainstreaming of extreme narratives. Much of the so I've been studying far-right communities online since 2016, and a lot of narratives that in 2016 mostly were circulating in fringe spaces have now become a part of mainstream political discourse. And I'll give two examples. The first is QAnon, where even though people are no longer really talking about Q or Q's drops, some of the tenets of Q's theories, like the idea that there's this cabal of democratic pedophiles, have become almost accepted among large swaths of the population. PRRI estimates that about 20% of Americans overall are QAnon believers and 28% of Republicans, which are huge numbers considering not just that QAnon is a false theory, but that it's a fairly outrageous theory when you actually get into what QAnon espouses. The second is I want to talk about transgender civil rights and its use as a wedge issue in the 2024 election. If you remember the ad, Kamala is for they, them, President Trump is for you, this sort of encapsulates this kind of culture war point of view that is using the rights of a very small minority of people, transgender folks, as sort of a folk devil in this last election. And I think if we compare this to, say, 2016, when North Carolina passed HB1, the bathroom bill, at that point we saw mass protests against it, and North Carolina lost a lot of money. But now this is no longer a fringe far-right issue. It has become a mainstream issue. And these kinds of wedge issues are building strange coalitions where you have people like the Proud Boys standing with groups like Gays Against Groomers and trans exclusionary radical feminists, which allows for very strange coalitions to be built across party lines. And the third thing that I want to emphasize is the increasing irrelevance of the mainstream media. There is a huge gap between people who consume mainstream news, people who mostly get their news online, and people who don't consume news at all, which is actually a fairly large group of people. In 2022, Pew found that only 38% of people kept up with the news at all. And in fact, when you look at people who engage with mainstream news sources, the people who engage with mainstream news the most became more Democratic in the 2024 election than they had in the 2020 election. The most engaged news consumers swung towards the Democrats, while the least engaged news consumers moved to Trump in the double digits. Where people are consuming political information is podcasts, YouTube, social media, and Facebook. We know that TikTok and Twitter were more likely to recommend Republican content, but there's these huge sort of areas of media like podcasts that have been understudied for quite a while. Bloomberg did a big study of 2,000 videos from the top 9 YouTubers, and they found that 80% of their audience was young men, that only 12% of their guests were women, but that these people really frequently discussed voting. They platformed Republican politicians. They argued against political correctness, transgender identity, and they really reinforced gender binaries and political isolationism. And when we look at the exit polls showing that Trump received more support among young men than any Republican candidate in more than 2 decades, I think there's a sort of clear overlap there between this type of media consumption that is really targeted towards young men and the political attitudes of that group. And what's at the root of this is an entire ecosystem that's really been cultivated by Republican funders, where they identify young talent in places like TikTok, develop and incubate it in places like PragerU, promote it by other influencers, and then amplify it on social media platforms that prioritize conservative content. There is not a similar platform or a similar system for center or center left or leftist creators. And because influencers are not bound by journalistic ethics or objectivity, they can take funding from anybody they want, but they can also speak directly to the concerns of young people and push populist messaging. So what we're increasingly looking at is a media landscape where there is a big cultural divide between highly educated people who live in cities and everyone else. And to the extent that the cultural signifiers of these highly educated people have become synonymous with Democrats, that really creates a gulf between the media class, the people who consume that media, and everyone else.
Wow, I've got a lot of follow-up questions, but I'm going to hold off because I want to bring in our other two panelists into the conversation, and then we'll come back and ask some more questions. Let me turn to you, Kate, and welcome. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Rick. And it's so great to be here with Allison and Josh now. And I'm going to echo a lot of Alice's talking points in my response or my opening response here. So the University of Washington Center for Informed Public, our team's been tracking rumors about the integrity of U.S. elections since 2020. So 2020, 2022, 2024. And we've been working to rapidly identify, analyze, and communicate about rumors about specifically election processes and procedures. In 2024, we worked on dozens of rumors that were spreading during mostly in the lead up and the couple days after the election. And we also created resources for helping others understand how election rumors mislead and spread. I would say to sort of like characterize just at a high level, some of our findings from that work this year, there were a lot of similar narratives to 2020. There were concerns about election errors being intentional. There was confusion about when and where to vote. There were, concerns of that voting machines weren't working correctly and conspiracy theories about those. But to sort of characterize some of maybe the differences, there was a lot less about mail-in ballots this time around, in part because I think the Republicans had realized that was probably hurting them to overly emphasize the insecurity of mail-in ballots. And so they'd pulled away from some of that messaging. There was much more focus on so-called non-citizen voting. Now, that's been a narrative since 2016, but this, starting in about January of 2024, we started to see messaging talking about immigrants voting and kind of that resonated with the just overall anti-immigration frames that were spreading, especially on the right. When we would kind of look back in over the things that we were really seeing, as we were leading up to the election, when the outcomes were still unknown, one of the things that was pretty apparent was that the right, the GOP and their supporters, has built this infrastructure to challenge election integrity and to change laws to benefit their candidates. And some of this infrastructure uses false and misleading rumors to motivate lawsuits, motivate protests, try to motivate changes to the law. And each time some of those events happen, they become these sort of pseudo events that reinforce this existing rumors. Like lawsuits can like launder rumors into public discourse in a way that makes them feel heavy and gives them a sort of sense of validity, even though they're still rumors and often untrue. And then these events often generate new rumors as well. And so we started to see this sort of infrastructure where the rumors inform changes that inform more rumors, right? And so there's this infrastructure that's kind of being laid down. Now, the big difference in 2024 was that this infrastructure went unused after the election, likely because Donald Trump won the election. The right really had set themselves up. They had a lot of different rumors that they were ready to move with. They were still developing them on election day. You can see Donald Trump talking about things that were happening in Pennsylvania, saying that things weren't fair. So they were prepared to use them. But they ended up not doing that when Donald Trump won and Republicans did very well. We did see activists on the left begin to spread rumors that they didn't trust the process. They say Elon Musk, something about Starlink and other kinds of things. So we did start to see sort of left-coded rumors about election fraud. But the big difference on that is they didn't get picked up by the establishment. They didn't get picked up by establishment Democrats. There were no protests. There was no sort of political apparatus to leverage these falsehoods to sort of contest the election. So that's very different from 2020. And in part because these different parties have oriented themselves differently around where these rumors and these falsehoods kind of play into their political strategies. More generally, not just around misinformation, but to echo some of Alice's points, when we start to look at more broadly these dynamics in the online spaces, which our team really focuses on. And we are seeing this as well. And we've done a couple of follow-up pieces about how the Democrats really tend to rely more on mainstream media and traditional logic of one-to-many broadcast and some other political organizing that reflects things we might have seen over the last 20 to 50 years. The current populist right here in the United States and actually elsewhere around the world is much more participatory. It offers opportunities for everyday people to contribute to the messaging. It has these infrastructure. It has its own infrastructure, its own media that's explicitly partisan. It has sort of an influencer structure that's kind of taken advantage of the dynamics of social media platforms and internet and online media to build this sort of alternative messaging infrastructure to mainstream and to sort of what the Democrats have that's really effective right now in resonating well with the way that the systems work. And so my colleagues and I have come up with this idea of a metaphor that we think is helpful of improvisational theater, right? So the messaging on the right isn't scripted. Nobody started out in the beginning of September thinking that they would end with memes of Donald Trump running with pets away from immigrants trying to save them, right? But this is what the propaganda ends with as they go into the debates. But what happens is they have this sort of they've got these influencers who are sort of always kind of improvising, trying to find the right messages that resonate with the frames of the day. And it's really, they participate with the audiences where the audiences are actually throwing things out, oh, my ballot doesn't look right. And that could become the next narrative of the day. And so we see this really interesting because we have this idea that the influencers on stage are the ones that are persuading people. But when you really start to look at the logic of what's happening, we see audiences having a lot of power, not direct power, but they have a lot of power to shape to influence the influencers, right? And so there's these two-way communication channels that really make it, there's these opportunities for everyday people to have agency and participate in the movements on the right that people on the left really haven't been feeling up in recent years. And so this kind of improvisation is playing really well for co-creating messaging that has been very effective. And that messaging, it might not be true, but it doesn't have to be true. It just has to feel true, as Alice was saying. It just has to kind of resonate with the narratives and frames of the day. And right now, the right has done very well, whether it's podcasts or X posts or TikTok videos.
Thank you for that. And I have a lot of questions for you too, but I'm going to first turn to Josh and to get some opening thoughts from him. You are muted.
You think I know?
It wouldn't be a Zoom webinar if someone.
Right. I just hosted one 2 hours ago on a different place. All right. Thanks so much. Thanks, Rick, for having me here. It is a great pleasure to be here with Kate and Alice, who have done amazing work for so many years, and I've learned so much from them over this time period. Since they've covered a lot of sort of what was happening with content around narratives, around these strategies, I'm going to zoom out a little bit and talk about sort of higher level changes in the social media and online environment, as opposed to the content on that environment, which hopefully will supplement this discussion nicely. I want to point to, I think, 4 changes I think that were present that made the online information environment different in 2024 as opposed to 2020, and especially as opposed to 2016. The first one was generative AI. We may talk more about generative AI later on. But I want to suggest that generative AI sucked up a lot of attention as we headed into the 2024 election. And when I think about the potential information consequences of generative AI, I think about this kind of as a level 1 and a level 2 effect. The level 1 effect is the one that we talk about all the time, that we're worried about, that generative AI is going to be used to in a way that leads to people believing things that aren't actually real, thinking they are real because of generative AI. And that's what sucked up the air in the room. That's what people were tremendously concerned about going into this election period. I want to suggest that we want to think a little bit more about what I would call a level 2 concern about generative AI, which is what happens when everybody's talking about the fact that there's generative AI out there and that there are these doubts about whether things that are real are actually real. And what does that do to our ability to actually convince people that things are true, that real things are in fact real? And heading into the election, we had written a piece at Brookings I wrote with Zeev Sanderson and Saul Messing about the kind of lessons from studying misinformation and how this might apply to Gen AI. And what was interesting about it was, I think that we did see the beginning of these kind of level 2 concerns. In particular, at one point when Trump was upset about the size of people showing up, the rallies showing up for Harris, and speculated, oh, no, this is just generative AI. Anyway, I'll park that for a second. We can come back to generative AI more. The second thing I think that was different about this, especially as compared to 2016, was just the rising proliferation of platforms. Kate and Alice have talked about this a bit, but there was a time not too long ago where if you wanted to understand politics and social media, you wanted to know what was going on Twitter, and then potentially what was going on Facebook as well. And here we just began to see, because of changes in people who were using Twitter, but the rise of more platforms. You had Truth Social, you had the Blue Sky Mastodon, that kind of world. But then most importantly, you had the rise of TikTok, which was not a player in the past, but was now. But in general, what you end up with is this much more diversified set of platforms in the information environment. So part of the coming together that we had on these social media platforms, for better or for worse, began to sort of spread. And that leads to, I think, a whole set of different types of questions and different types of interactions that people are having online. Similar to that, I think what was a huge difference is that as we rolled into 2024, we were really hitting this point where the way in which content is delivered to people on social media platforms was really shifting over from what had dominated for quite some time, which was the social graph feed, where the content that could show up in your feeds was determined by your choices of who you would follow, who your friends were. Originally, this had been the kind of reverse chronological. When these platforms first started, you were just seeing the most recent content by people you knew. Then the algorithm took over to try to show you content that it thought you would want to see that would keep you on the platform. But for a long time, that was still generally constrained to the potential content that could be in your feed, which was dictated by who it was you had chosen to follow, who it was you had chosen to associate with. Then with the massive success of TikTok and its sort of For You algorithm, this question of the platform trying to show you content that you wanted to see spread from just content you wanted to see of your potential content from your friends and the people you were following to the whole platform itself. So I think we still have to really wrap our heads around what that means for people's social media experiences, and in particular, what it means in terms of their experiences regarding politics and social media. And then finally, I think we've seen, along with this meteoric rise of TikTok, the sort of rise of the short form video. And both Alice and Kate have talked a little bit previously about podcasts, about long form videos, but we also have this kind of tremendous amount of information that's now being delivered along with the rise of podcasts and the growing importance of podcasts in these longer form, very long form videos. You have the rise of the short form videos. I want to stress a couple other points just quickly in my last minute. I think one other thing that we have to acknowledge about the 2024 election that was different from the 2020 and previous elections in the United States is that you have two of the owners of these platforms that were closely involved in election campaigns. Previous elections, I think the platforms were interested in appearing kind of nonpartisan with respect to the elections. Now you had President Trump, who started his own platform, Truth Social, which was active during this election. And then you have Elon Musk, who has purchased Twitter, renames it as X, but also then becomes heavily involved in the campaign on one side, becoming the biggest donor to the Trump campaign. I think the other thing that goes on, and this sort of like undergirds all of what Kate and Alice were talking about, but as you headed into this election, there was clearly a rollback of content moderation, which as opposed to in 2020, when after 2016, 2020 had seen a rise of content moderation around politics. Heading into 2024, we were seeing less content moderation around politics. And then the final thing I will note is just, I think one thing that's sad about 2024 is at the end of the day, we won't actually know as much about what happened on these platforms as we did in previously, and especially in 2020. I was very fortunate to be part of something that's called the US 2020 Facebook and Instagram election study, where we collaborated with researchers at Meta to be able to do studies of what was happening on Facebook and Instagram in the course of this election, to run experiments. This was kind of unprecedented views into what was happening. And one of our big hopes from doing this was that by 2024, this would start to become a norm, that other platforms would be doing this, that this would be what we would expect around the time of elections. Instead, it went in the opposite direction. We have nothing like this. So it's going to be harder for us to know, especially at scale, while you can still do this kind of very focused ethnographic work, the kind that Alice in particular specializes in. Doing the kind of large at scale projects becomes much more complicated in 2024 than it was in 2020.
Thank you for that. And, we could probably have a whole webinar just on the difficulty that researchers and the attacks on researchers in 2024. It's a somewhat different story that I want to go into today, but anyone who's interested in that, just Google the names of anyone who's working in this area, and you'll find plenty of stories on that. I do want to stick with you for a minute, Josh, first, and ask you about your last point about content moderation and about the choices that people at these companies were making. One of the most controversial things was the choice to label Donald Trump's tweets and posts in the 2020 election, followed by the deplatforming after January 6th, and that reversal, the Hunter Biden laptop story not being promoted because of the concern that it was disinformation, the backlash to that. And so I'm wondering if you could contrast that atmosphere with at least a few stories I've seen that suggested, and this goes to your last point, about Elon Musk's lack of objectivity, that Elon Musk was tweaking the algorithm to send X users pro-Trump messages and anti-Harris messages. What do we know about I've heard these rumors, but what do we know about the truth of that? Is there enough data that we could actually track that down and have a reliable sense of what's different?
Yeah, I think that's the last point. The answer is, I don't know, is the answer to my question. I'm happy to hear what Kate and Alice have to say in this regard. But the point that I want to note is that, prior to the 2024 election, Twitter data had been made accessible to researchers. And prior to 2022, Twitter data had been made accessible to researchers. This was done in a variety of formats. Some of it was kind of Wild West in the early days. Others, as time went by, it became more organized. But the previous regime at Twitter was, at least on their good days, willing to cooperate with academics in order to allow some degree of transparency into what was happening on the platform. So I think from a researcher standpoint, it sort of totally changed the ballgame, where it became just much harder to study what was happening at scale. And I think, I'll defer to Kate and Alice in terms of what content they saw in their work that they were doing on X, because we weren't able to do the kind of work that we normally do in this regard because our data access regime had changed dramatically. But I will also just add, before passing it to them, that as a political scientist, I do think it really changes things that media platforms are now seen as, these social media platforms have moved from trying to position themselves as being seen as nonpartisan actors, where you have the heads of where you have Twitter taken over by someone who is very clearly advocating for one of the presidential candidates in the election. I think this is kind of a sea change. It's hard to imagine how we sort of walk back from that, independent of legislation, the kind of legislation we're not going to see anytime soon, maybe much farther down the road. But I do think this was a sea change after years of trying to talk about, we were being brought in to talk about, were the platforms really nonpartisan? Did they have this lean? Did they have this lean? But to have it go from was there an implicit partisan lean to these platforms, to having such a clearly explicit partisan association with the platforms, I think was something that was quite significantly different in 2024.
Kate or Alice, do you have thoughts on this question of algorithmic manipulation, or maybe something less sophisticated than that, which is just Elon Musk having 200 million followers or whatever he has and sending out messages that were very partisan.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, as Josh says, we don't have a great way to measure that anymore. Our team went from being able to gather billions of tweets a day to being able to download 10,000 tweets a day, and you can imagine that vastly changes the amount of insight you can have. What we do know is that Twitter continued to be a place where who we might have traditionally thought as gatekeepers had, in terms of media, people that were using professional media standards had very little ability to reach their audiences. Even if they had a large number of followers, the content that tended to get picked up and engaged with the most, whether it was, I think we studied this in the context of both assassination attempts and then a year prior, some of the fires in Maui and some other kinds of events that were happening at that time. And you can see over and over again that the accounts that are getting the most attention are influencer accounts that have just gained followers by posting breaking news during crisis events without much care into whether or not it was true, right? And so you've got an information environment that in the last 2 to 4 years has become even harder to find and figure out whether or not you can trust information. And regardless of, we could take out the labels, we could take out any of the content moderation stuff. They also undid the verification system where you could actually verify that people were who they said they were. And they also took out the ability to really traverse links, right? So to get back to the links of the original content, the content that had links to other sites is demoted, or it's hard to make that to kind of track back. And so the platform had taken action to make it harder to verify information within it. And so that's even be above and beyond what Musk may or may not have been doing to manipulate things towards himself. We know that most of the influencers that have gained a lot of attention in the last couple of years have done that because he's interacting with them. And because he interacts with them, whether he's doing it on purpose or not, he's now the central figure of the Twitter/X environment. And he's the kingmaker in there. And now that he's being explicitly political, that's a lot of power. Especially as X is still part of the news making. It's not just news reporting, it's news making that happens there.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, and I mean, in full agreement with Kate and Josh on their points, is that we also saw sort of an unprecedented thing where mainstream news outlets like the Washington Post decided they were not going to do a presidential endorsement, which they previously had done. And that was directly coming from an owner who is also part of sort of the elite sort of tech, financially wealthy, a billionaire class, let's just say, and the LA Times as well. So we're not just seeing this shift, I think, solely on social media. I think we're also seeing this shift in traditional news media as well. And often we tend to think of these things as very separate, but they really are interlinked and intertwined in a lot of ways. And that journalists often look to social media for story ideas and to sort of gauge the vibes, or what people are talking about. And obviously journalists are heavy participators in social media as well. So there's, I think, this larger ecosystem where you see sort of a pulling back on sort of more centrist or liberal points of view and a more of a promotion of more conservative or Republican points of view.
Let me stick with you, Alice. Something that struck me when hearing your comments as well as Kate's was, it seemed like there were you were talking about two different phenomena kind of overlapping. One is the phenomenon of false speech being shared, dogs and cats being eaten in Ohio. And the other is just kind of a different way that people communicate and organize for political action. And Kate made this point as well. So when you talked about the trans issue, I didn't hear much, and maybe there is, and you just didn't get to it. I didn't hear that much about false information as much as this was a culturally significant thing that was, Democrats or the left were just outgained in terms of what their communication strategy was. And so I'm wondering if you and then Kate could kind of try to disentangle these two things if they're capable of being unraveled or disentangled, so that is this really a problem of people getting false information, or is this more about, we're in different camps and people are receptive to different cultural messages?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so. We did a study of the messaging around Drag Queen Story Hour, which was sort of a somewhat earlier than the election touch point around these sort of claims about trans people being dangerous to children in some way. And we looked at the narratives that were coming out that were, we sort of looked at a large corpus of content and we characterized the narratives that were coming out. And I would characterize most of them as false. So things like trans people are mentally ill, or trans people are more likely to be criminals, or trans people are, dangerous to children, or they're un-American, or they're satanic. And the thing that was really interesting about this study is that we compared this messaging to two previous moral panics. One was a moral panic most people don't remember, but it's the sexual psychopathy moral panic of the 1940s and 1950s. And the other one was Anita Bryant's Save Our Children campaign from the 1970s, which was one of the first big evangelical Christian political campaigns against an ordinance that tried to establish civil rights for gay and lesbian people in Miami. And the interesting thing was that if you look at the narratives, they're virtually identical. It's just the new narratives all espouse anxiety around gender diversity and sort of the proliferation of gender identities. And what we see with a lot of these political positions is that they do rely in many cases on disinformation or on or information that is selectively presenting something or is selectively sort of cherry picking certain things. Like, for example, yes, there are people who regret transitioning, but they're a tiny minority of people. But those are the ones whose voices get amplified over the many numbers of trans people who are just living sort of like happy everyday lives. And the difficult thing when it comes down to determining whether something is false or true in the political sphere is that virtually every controversial political topic has people spinning evidence in different ways, right? And when we think about how we come to our political beliefs, I think a lot of us have this sort of imagined idea that we sit and we look at the evidence and we weigh it, and we say, oh, well, I believe this because of that. But in reality, most people believe what they believe because the people around them believe the same thing. You're more likely to have your political beliefs from your parents, your friends, your spouse. Marriage across party lines is the lowest it's ever been in the United States right now. And so trying to disentangle what is political spin versus disinformation can be really hard, especially in this information environment where it is very, very difficult sometimes to cut through the political noise. But what we're finding with some of these things is that they really are relying not just on disinformation, but in many cases on conspiracy theories that are very sticky, but cast people not as misguided, but as evil, right? There's this sort of black and white thinking where you have good guys and bad guys. And in many of these political narratives, they're putting people into categories based on this sort of black and white thinking.
Kate?
Just to build on that a little bit, we've been talking about, we often think that misinformation is about like bad facts, but actually when we've been doing the research, it's really hard to operationalize misleading information that way. And it's really about both facts and frames, right? And frames, how we interpret the evidence, selects which evidence to attend to. And we actually see disinformation happen both through the presentation of false evidence or false facts, but also through presenting distorted frames to get people to look at things through a distorted frame and see things in a way that selects certain evidence and buries other evidence. And conspiracy theories are similar, that people continue to look at evidence in the world through a distorted frame or a corrupted frame where they repeatedly see things as a conspiracy that could be interpreted other ways. We found that to be much more useful than focusing on true and false facts, right? And it gives us a little bit more ability to see what's actually going on. But we look at your original question, when we're talking about media effects, and I did that in my answer a little bit, we tended to start to describe, especially right after the election up until the inauguration, we got away from thinking about whether or not the messages were true. We started thinking about, why did the messages resonate? Why did these messages spread? Why did Donald Trump get elected? And started to see not just like veracity and values, but media dynamics as well. And that's part of the answer. But I don't think that means we have to take veracity completely out of the question. There's an interesting study, I can't remember who it is off the top of my head, but they were looking at misinformation and the spread of misinformation all around the world in different contexts. And they found that when you look not at the individuals, but at the parties that are using it effectively, it's right-wing populists around like 26 different countries. It wasn't just conservatives and it wasn't just populists, it was right-wing populists in particular that are strategically using and benefiting from the spread of misinformation. And so I don't think we want to take it completely out of the question, but it's not just about whether things are true and false. It's about which stories are resonating and how are those activating people to participate in politics. One of the things that we have been talking about in our work is to not just think about the everyday people and who might be getting caught up with it, but how is it strategically being leveraged by particular political parties? And to be honest, we've been using a term that has a definition that I find pretty powerful, and the term that we've been using is actually bullshit. And the reason bullshit is interesting is because it doesn't mean it's necessarily true or necessarily false. It just means it doesn't care whether or not it's true. It doesn't care whether or not it's false. It's just there to be persuasive. It's opportunistic. And so we've been really seeing right now this sort of participatory dynamics on the right as part of like a bullshit machine. And one of the reasons, in one of the ways that we can see right now after inauguration, after, we're several weeks into the new administration, we actually have people who have risen to power, risen to visibility and risen to power on the spread of conspiracy theories. In fact, sometimes provably false conspiracy theories. They are now in the cabinet, running administrations, whether it's the health agencies, the intelligence agencies in the United States, and other agencies as well. And so, and you can see Elon Musk spreading conspiracy theories as part of his justification of taking certain actions with Doge. And so, I do think, again, we don't want to completely separate the fact that some of these things are just patently untrue, and that one party right now is particularly good at leveraging untrue things to gain power and maintain power. And yet the veracity isn't the only thing that's happening here.
Thanks for that. I do want to turn to the audience questions before we have to wrap up. But before I do, I want to come back to Josh and your comments about AI. It seemed that you were doing a little bit of the liar's dividend thing that we've heard from Bobby Chesney and Danielle Citron, that just being able to call into question truthful things by claiming maybe it was AI generated has an effect. But I want you to look like a little bit to the future. And could AI make things worse, or is it already the kind of thing? I saw there's an elections analyst named Clayton Mitchell, who you may have heard of, who was involved with Trump in 2020, trying to get the election results changed in Georgia and other places. And she was complaining that Grok, the AI tool at X, was saying that she was like, spreading false rumors about the election, because I was like, she was complaining, why is Grok being unfair to me? And I was thinking, maybe, AI would actually serve as a way to counter conspiracy theories and all this other stuff.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, I think in some ways, again, I want to come back to this, like thinking about this sort of level 1 and the level 2 thing, right? We have been worried forever about these level 1 effects, that AI is going to just turn into another form of misinformation. It's going to make people believe things that aren't true and think they are true. And if I think the big thing that everyone was worried about is that there's going to be some deep fake video that plays at a crucial moment of a campaign and swings a ton of votes in one direction or the other direction because of that deep fake video. And in some ways, the deep fake video that's going to swing the election is kind of like Texas turning blue. It's always the thing. Everyone always says it's going to happen, and it's going to happen in about, in the future sometime, right? And we keep not getting there. And that doesn't mean it won't happen in the future, but I think it's really important to center on this fact that the most impactful video in the 2024 election was a true video. It was real. It was Joe Biden in the first debate. It had a massive impact on what happened in the aftermath of the rest of that election. It wasn't a deepfake video. As we look globally across the world, we can find instances of AI being used in counterproductive ways in terms of elections and electoral integrity. I think the one that got the most play in 2024, when famously half the world's population was in countries that were holding elections, was a fake audio recording in Slovakia that people brought up as we get close to the Slovak parliamentary elections. But in some ways, if you go back and look at the predictions at how AI was going to sort of ruin the 2024 round of elections, almost none of that came to fruition. Now, it doesn't mean it won't come to fruition, but I think we also, we want to think about, one way to think about AI in a kind of political economy sense of this is as a tool, right? So one way to think about social media is that social media tremendously lowered the barriers to distributing content. Right? Before social media, you needed access to mainstream media. You needed, an army of people to distribute flyers. Social media tremendously lowers the cost of distributing content, but you still have to produce the content, right? And so AI is a tool that can help us lower the cost of producing content. And we can think about really negative ways where that might be consequential. And if you think, for example, about foreign influence campaigns, as we look to the future, right, it's easier to run a foreign influence campaign in English if you have lots of English speakers around. It's harder to run a foreign influence campaign in Hungarian or Finnish. AI makes that much, much easier. Right. It's now become a situation. I mean, I was listening to this. I don't know if any of you listen to this like fantastic podcast series on The Economist about Scam Inc. and all these people they have recruited to do these scams. And there's essentially this human trafficking going on because of it. But now they're going to replace them all with AI. And they don't have to do the human trafficking anymore because they don't need people who speak English anymore. And they can just have people use AI. And it's actually cheaper for them to employ low wage workers than it is to do human trafficking. Right. So we can think in that kind of manner. So from foreign influence campaigns, this is very, very worrisome. There are other aspects of elections where it might be actually very positive, right? If you think about people trying to reach constituents in many languages in local elections, and you only have the budget to normally produce ads in English and Spanish, but now you can also do it in Tagalog and Vietnamese, maybe it's something that will increase participation going forward. And there were lots of kind of creative uses of AI in elections over the course of 2024. The most interesting one was in Pakistan, where one of the candidates was imprisoned after the election, and they used an AI-generated version of him to speak the words that he wasn't able to speak because he was in prison. So I think there's a lot of different things going on here. I think this political economy framework about it is a useful way of looking to the future and thinking about in what ways it might benefit democratic participation. I mean, Rick, the point that you led with, right, that this may be the case where we can use AI, in the cat and mouse game that is always the production and detection of content online. But I think there are also creative ways that campaigns may use this in elections in the future in places where, elections are competitive and are free and fair in this regard. But it's absolutely something we should keep an eye on. But I think we want to have ways of thinking about it. And I think this concept of thinking of like, okay, who benefits from this lower cost of production? Where is that on the margins likely to have more of an effect? I think may be a way of looking forward to where we're going to see this more in elections in the future.
Well, if we're going to have less human trafficking, I guess that's one good thing.
That's a positive. Can I piggyback on that? This is a point I left out of my opening statement, but if in this we could see before the US election in 2024, because it was happening all over the world, is that the big contributions from generative AI in terms of these elections were not deep fakes at all, or misleading content that was meant to look real, but visual propaganda that reinforced strategic narratives and frames, like the images of Donald Trump carrying the pets. These didn't make any truth claim at all, but they were incredibly effective. And they were, after the pet thing, there were dozens of different images created by some professionally, but a lot of them just by internet activists, and they were spread massively, and Elon Musk retweets them, Donald Trump retweets them, and they all sort of reinforce this anti-immigrant frame. And it's not, none of it was about trying to trick anyone. It was all just like, it's so cheap now to create visual propaganda, and we're saturated in it. And this is quite different from this fear of being tricked. It's not really, it wasn't about that in 2024. And I can imagine, yes, there are going to be times where deep fakes do trick people, but that's not the main use case of generative AI in politics that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, nobody's thinking Donald Trump is carrying cats when he's, yes.
And the final point I'll make about Gen AI is that we're increasingly seeing Gen Z and Gen Alpha using tools like ChatGPT as a search engine, or obviously with Google, you're seeing AI-generated search results before you're seeing anything else. And the few studies that we do have on the reliability of political information that are coming from LLMs are not great. Right now, we're seeing that they are spreading inaccurate information. And if people are depending on LLMs to get information about like local political candidates, for example, that could be very dangerous. And with what we're seeing with the Trump administration is rolling back sort of AI safety and responsible AI initiatives in favor of promoting American hegemony through AI, American-made AI tool dominance. And so I think there's going to be even more pressure to sort of scale back efforts to reduce hallucinations in AI and increase reliability of AI answers. So that's something I think we can enjoy experiencing in the future.
Josh, I know you wanted to make a brief follow-up point before I turn to these audience questions.
Yeah, super fast. On Alice's point, we actually have a study in the field where we're doing a follow-up study right now where we had a paper in Nature where we had shown that Googling online actually made people more likely to believe false news stories were true, not less likely to believe false news stories were true. We're in the process of replicating that using generative AI and search type functions using Perplexity. So we'll have results on that soon. The preliminary results suggest that the LLMs are not that different from Google, which was too bad. We kind of were hoping it was going to be better, but we'll see. And this is, things are evolving really quickly. And just on Kate's point, I wanted to note as well, back on the conversation that Kate and Alice were having a little while ago about misinformation and whether it should only be about misinformation. I think Kate's point about the images being reinforcing these narratives, the images are not these level 1 problem. People don't believe they're true. That's exactly this point about why moving beyond the misinformation paradigm can be really helpful. And I just want to call it to the audience. There's a great paper in Science by Jenny Allen and colleagues where they look at the influence of true news stories and false news stories on Facebook. This was around vaccination. But it was really interesting that because of the greater reach of true news stories, actually the most impactful story in making people less likely to want to get vaccinated wasn't all the false news stories about vaccines, but it was actually a true news headline from the Chicago Tribune that said, "Doctor gets vaccine, dies 2 weeks later." It was a true story, right? But it was the framing of it and the way people were interpreting it. And so again, I think this shows the value of as the field evolves, as the research evolves here, about not getting so hung up on just this misinformation versus not misinformation, but beginning to think about these sort of larger information ecosystems and how these things play out. Okay,
we have 7 minutes and I have 7 questions. I'm not going to ask all of them. I'm going to start with this one, which is something I was thinking of as well. And let me start with Alice. What are the expectations for the 2026 midterms? Are they going to be compromised with amped up disinformation? What's the information environment going to be? And I'm, obviously can't predict the future, but based on what you're seeing right now.
I think if we continue to see a pullback on content moderation from the major social media platforms, we will continue to have a proliferation of disinformation on social media platforms. The difficult thing with content moderation is it's very expensive and you mostly hear about it when it doesn't work. And I think a lot of social media companies, Mark Zuckerberg has said outright that he's tired of trying to do the right thing. He just wants to pull back on it. He wants to move forward. But that's not great, right? That's obviously going to make it much more difficult for researchers and politicians to combat false narratives on social media. Beyond that, I think we'll continue to see, as Josh said, platforms like TikTok. I think we'll continue to see politicians all trying to appear on things like podcasts and Hot Ones and whatever the trendy show of the moment is. I think that will be interesting. I think some of those efforts will be effective. I think some of them won't be. But right now, I don't see a lot of indicators saying that the problem is going to get better.
Before I turn to Kate and then Josh, let me just come back to you, Alice, for a second. Someone else asked about Gavin Newsom bringing on Steve Bannon, and what do we make of that?
I mean, I understand the idea there is to try to have, the idea that you can have a civil conversation with people that you disagree with. But that I don't think that is a great strategy, right? I mean, Steve Bannon is a really powerful and really effective political actor. And I think what Gavin Newsom should be doing is trying to platform people who are further to the left, right? Rather than giving more airtime to people who are further to the right. Right now, there's a real lack of high profile far left voices in American political discourse because the entire political system has sort of moved to the right. And so if I was a powerful Democratic politician right now, I would be trying to cultivate relationships with lefty content creators that young people like. I would be platforming people like that. I wouldn't necessarily be listening to Steve Bannon yet again and his points of view.
I did see that Bernie Sanders had like the best net favorables of any of the major politicians, and I was thinking what his age is, and he is not, the future of the Democratic Party in terms of, where things are going to be 10, 15 years from now. Kate?
I'm just to respond to Gavin Newsom's move. I didn't get a full chance to explain it, but we've been thinking about, the right-wing media ecosystem as an improvisational theater with this sort of theater of influencers, or maybe even sort of pro wrestling. There's this idea that the left needs to build its own infrastructure so that maybe is similar. I think that's probably the right move. But just jumping into the ring with the right-wing influencers in front of their audiences is probably not the way.
Josh, let me come to you, and let me throw in another question into the mix as well from another person who asks, how do election officials and candidates who are committed to truth combat disinformation? Should they be going on the podcast? Should they be doing something else? What is the right way to go?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely the $64,000 question, and you've got lots of debate going on this within Democratic circles right now, and people taking different tactics on it. I will say, I think it's normal in the aftermath of losing an election for parties to go through this introspection and reflective period of time to try to figure out what went wrong, what went right in the previous election. I do really want to stress, though, this election in 2024, because of what has happened since the administration has taken office and because of the narrative the administration has portrayed, is you would believe this election to be a landslide, right? And it was, and I describe this election to people as one election with two results. In terms of power, yes, you now have a full constellation of power on one side of the political aisle in Washington, D.C. But in terms of the outcomes of the elections, right, they were, the swing states all went to Trump, but by a little bit. But actually, if you look at the Senate races in the swing states, of the 5 Senate races in the swing states, the Republicans only won one of those 5 states. And in the House of Representatives, the Republicans lost votes in this election, right? So a lot of what the Democrats, I mean, nobody wants to hear this, but a lot of what the Democrats did in 2024 actually worked. It didn't quite work enough, but it worked a lot. And so I think at this point, we want to be careful from overreacting. This isn't, losing 60 seats and losing 49 out of 50 states. That being said, I don't want to say that everything is fine and nothing should be done, right? There were definitely economic headwinds that the party was running against in 2024. Incumbents lost all over the world in 2024, which was a really interesting time. So there's a danger of overreacting to this. That being said, you always want to try to meet voters where voters are. And in my opening remarks, one of the things I talked about is in today's information environment, voters are in a lot of different places. And this combination podcast, YouTube videos, YouTube, simulcasts of these podcasts obviously are generating these kind of enormous audiences with lots and lots of people watching them. So if you are a politician, I think you want to be thinking, Kate's point that she made earlier about relying on, and Alice had made a similar point earlier, relying on traditional media, top down, one to many. It's clearly not the way that younger people are getting their information these days. And we know that, Trump did much better with younger voters than previous Republican candidates had done. So I think some thinking about how to meet voters where they are is absolutely in order.
I've got so many more questions, but we are out of time. Maybe we'll do a reprise of this before the 2026 midterms. Thank you to Alice Marwick, Kate Starbird, and Josh Tucker. Reminder, our next event is on April 10th on political polarization and extremism. I'm Rick Hasen. Thank you all for joining us. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.